Good evening. Thank you very much. I want to, well, that's not my presentation. I want to thank Miguel, Leida for this invitation. And I want to tell you that I'm going to take a total twist to what's been presented throughout these days in these plenaries. My presentation has an epistemic positioning located in a very specific context from the feminism of politics and situated knowledge. I'm going to talk about the concerns, specifically in Colombia, with everything that has been happening after the peace process in Colombia with one of the oldest guerrillas in the continent, the FARC. That one is not my presentation. The one above. Can you all hear me? I want to start by giving you a quote by some feminist geographers. One of them is Australian, the other one is from the US. They're Ibsen and Graham. If we ever thought that economy was totally politicized in reactions, just recently we understood that depoliticization requires for us to become subjects that are capable of changing economic policy. After a long negotiation process that lasted for 5 years, the guerrillas of the FARC have been facing a series of transformations of their day-to-day activities in the war, built for more than a half a century, where they had been the main characters. They reached 26 zones of the country called points of concentration that were actually later on established just as territorial spaces for training and reincorporation. On June 27, 2017 was when they gave up their weapons. The pathway for the implementation of the agreements has been around for more than a year, and it seems a fact that the FARC, which are now an alternative force, revolutionary force, have positioned themselves as a political and social actor with no appeal to the weapons that had defined them as a guerrilla movement. However, they continue to exist, and several of their former soldiers and some commanders continue fighting, and the pathways has not been easy, as shown by reports presented by international verification. Apart from supporting the guerrillas and the few warranties for their lives, more than 65 guerrilla members have been assassinated. The implementation of agreements has been focused on the lack of political will of the government and the hindrances of the political sector that makes more with the continuity of the war. The reflections that I'm presenting here are the produce of the research that I have developed on masculinities and post-agreements that has looked into the construction of masculinities of men, former soldiers of two guerrilla groups, and paramilitary men and FARC guerrilla members. We resorted to the biographical method, looking at the narratives of former combatants and the entry, permanence, demobilization, and transition to civilian life. We also visited one of the territorial spaces where, through different approach, we're able to observe the day-to-day life of former members of the guerrillas, and we observed how they're working three cooperatives that work in that area. Approaching this from the subjectivity and the masculinities of these former combatants has allowed us to have a different perspective of how war has been experienced in Colombia, acknowledging the different technologies and devices that have been used for the construction of warrior masculinities of the groups and the difficulties in the articulation process of former guerrilla members in civilian life. The approach has been very uncommon because the predominant analysis is war, political sciences, economics, or sociology, around the most conventional subjects. The questions about masculinities continue being subjects that have not been addressed because of a lack of comprehension about the conflict and considered for the reincorporation process in our country. These subjects continue to be considered as minor, and they seem not to have the interest of a lot of people, and they're even seen with despise by politologists and researchers that are looking into more structural matters of the war. The reflection of community war that's related to the cultivation of an individual for that economy is also a very uncommon approach, because they typically just focus on the negative or positive impact of those economies, simply just focusing on structural generalizations. However, this entry allows us to understand one of the biggest difficulties for these economies to be accomplished: the breakage of individual desires associated with capitalism. This is the reason why I'll be representing some reflections upon what I have called the traces of a community solidarity found within the former soldiers of FARC, which are identified as an important aspect for the satisfactory transit of these men and women to new day-to-day activities, to the so-called civilian life, and even are fundamental to be shared with other populations of the country. This reflection, I propose it from the feminist perspective and the sustenance of life, economies in war. In the most structural analysis of war from the FARC economies, or as a guerrilla organization, we talked about the different social moments associated with a type of territorial control. One thing was the type of control during the predominance of a farming economy, of self-subsistence, or living from coffee, and one more when drugs entered the economy. However, I don't want to approach those reflections because they're broadly known in my country. Instead, I want to think about the experience of FARC from the narratives of their actors from a feminist perspective of economy. This feminist criticism consists of looking at the Astrapota perspective that tends to, and I quote, theorize economy as a stable structure that reproduces itself and that's immune to the reproduction of those even more frequent cases of day-to-day politics, Ibsen and Graham. The authors, considered the heterogeneity of communities and analyzed, localized, and produced economies in which surpass the idea of thinking of capitalist entities per se and think of subjects and places. This would be more about the type of policy about the place, being in a place, and what self-cultivation of individuals imply. If we have gone through a rigorous critique of capitalism, a lot has been talked about here. It's been characterized by the small groups of owners as owners of life and death in the planet, and in Latin America are expressed in the way of administration of business, politics, and justice, and that somehow in a very specific manner talk about the hyper-masculinization of these spheres and the mutations of power and prestige incarnated especially by males all throughout Latin America, and more specifically in Colombia. As Ibsen and Graham have elaborated on, our ideas about politics have been looked at from a totalitarist, capitalist, metaphysical view that has prevented the understanding of heterogeneities, which has resulted also in the elimination of other practices that non-capitalistic theories have seen. Therefore, we need to tune up our methodological and conceptual tools to deontologize the analysis of capitalism and better understand how to articulate anti-capitalist fights. I can therefore assert that the FARC were not outside capitalism. However, there are other practices, at least near to what we call a community theory, and the community theory is what I want to emphasize in my presentation. By community economics, I will understand the activities related to the territories and the commons and the communality and community at the level of principles like solidarity, the strengthening of popular sectors, local practices linked with significant places. According to Federici, this is the type of relationship based on the principles of cooperation, responsibility among people, separating themselves from the idea of united people by exclusive interest, such as those that separate them from others, such as communities based on ethnicity or religion. On the other hand, I'm interested in talking about the commons economy that allow for the creation of reproduction forms. Can you all hear me? Given the salaried work and the submission of the capitalist relationships that mean an effort to collectivize reproductive work, this is the common point of the creation of mutual links and collective forms of life. This approach, centered on the subject, leads us to think of other beings capable of choosing their way of being, thinking, and acting through the transformation of their practices in the future. These subjects are not only found in the indigenous peoples or coming from Africa, but also in farming communities, in urban cities, and even people who fought within the FARC guerrillas can talk about this experience of trying to become common individuals. It is important to highlight that my position is not to do apology of the FARC. I stopped there just to try to understand some peculiarities associated with the masculinities and the femininity of the FARC, to try to more deeply understand what the conflict has meant and their experience for us in Colombia, which I consider is vital input to face more sensibly the challenges we're facing through the signature of the agreements. Through the practices of the former guerrilla members of the FARC, I want to highlight three characteristics that can distinguish the individuals. One of them, ethics; two, collective well-being; two, the de-articulation of domestic work as sexually divided work; and three, mobilization of work. The first one. Next slide. I'm going to show a few fragments of the narrations of the former guerrilla members. I won't read them. I'm going to read just one. At the end of the 90s, I was very enthused about working, producing coke, because that's what there was there. That's where I see how the people organized themselves to work. Everything was progressing, health centers were established, schools and all that. That was all proposed by the FARC, so I started to approach some of my friends. Then the year 2000 came and I started working with them. In the narration, several guerrilla members, we all started to work for the common well-being. This is evidence in the narrations, like by one man born in the Chocó, one of the departments with the poorest departments in Colombia. We also find such will for collective well-being in the narrations of other members of the community, looking for a space of a transformation of individualistic society subject to impoverishment. Even though the armed group was predominant, there's a report that recognizes that there's around 52 boys and girls who admitted to have participating in the training process that would reassert the position they occupy in the armed fight. The experience starts as a training process, even if this is focused on the collective situation. From the entry of the interviewed combatants, we can assert that their ideas include not only military training, but also political, social, economic training to recognize the reality of the country and other knowledge that would also guarantee the health of the members of the group. What we were able to evidence in the research is that there is a clear difference between the warriors and the paramilitary and the military subjectivity of the war. The first one is a subjectivity that reduces empathy, that forces to concealing the empathy when we damage the other emotionally. I became tough-hearted, referring to the paramilitary group. That's what one of my interviewees said. These links, these liaisons, beyond the mafia relationship with the bosses, which could give different overtones to the cruelty that these men were subject to that finally helped configure the paramilitaries and elitistic form to defend the property in the nation state. The second one is the guerrilla subjectivity that produces changes oriented to taking care of others, their co-workers mostly, and with more relationship with civilians and different local levels of the society, establishing the conviviality, going through different day-to-day life activities within the FARC or other technologies of sociability, such as studying the reality of the country and social inequalities, constructing relationships of friendship and love, building partnership within the group, and many others that were able to build the story of shared we, us, the pedagogics of cruelty, of war itself. Next, the articulation of domestic work as sexually divided work. In war, something that drew our attention very powerfully when it comes to the social reconstruction of masculinity of FARC is that they did not have a social distinction of work, sexual distinction of work, but the FARC always within their members had a strong presence of women. They talk about almost nearly 40% of their members who were females, who had military responsibilities that men and the fronts, the same as men and guerrilla fronts. Even if the critique to the guerrilla has focused on the body of women to guarantee reproduction of life at all levels, what we hear from the members of FARC is that life was to be guaranteed by and between everybody. This concept is not minor. The materialistic feminist criticism has focused on how the Marxist view of chauvinism, of machismo, has been contradictory in our lives, going beyond just the production of commodities, through the subsistence of reproductive work of women, charged with preparing the foods for workers. Nothing was said about the women and the domestic activity. Reproductive work was subject to the capitalist view, which led to the understanding that capitalist economy is sustained on a type of work, family, sexuality, and procreation, the nuclear family that reproduces the labor force. So reproductive work for FARC and the other members, far from family, sexual, and reproductive relationships, was fundamental for the economy of survival, taking care of one another. In the last times, it's been more common for women to join paid jobs or even become part of institutions such as the army and the academy. It's still uncommon that the maintenance work of life is taken on by men, and therefore the integration of several women from middle and high classes to these spheres have displaced work to impoverished women and racialized that have to sustain and reproduce not only their lives, but the lives of those other privileged social and racial sectors. This historic moment for the FARC is constituted by the possibility to maintain these collectivization practices of day-to-day work in their new community configurations. From a feminist perspective, that subjectivity would be lost in the context of war if these men or women were to be domesticated with the mechanisms of labor, family, and housing. And I'm going to quickly jump to my conclusions. In spite of the anchorage to narco trafficking and illegal businesses, especially those profits coming from drugs, many of their members were not lured by the mafia desire. On the contrary, what happens in what we see from the discourse of former combatants is that they felt isolated from the classical sexual division of labor, which accounts empirically for the complexity of the reproduction process of subjectivities and the various political organizational strategies of alternatives to capitalism. Therefore, I believe that we are here witnessing the return to social life of men and women who, in spite of the fact that they were willing to war, they're also now back with some subjectivities that are far from competitiveness and struggle that has been become a part of the 20th century Colombian people, just like Santiago Castro and Eduardo Restrepo mentioned it. Men and women are going back to war with ethics, with common ethics of life. This happened in the practice of community life, and I think that's an area to pay attention to in the process of reincorporation. Well, we already know that subjects for community life is not easy. Some researchers have tried to prove in Colombia, and we know it's a complex process, unfinished, imperfect, and the most difficult would be to destroy the capitalist subjectivities and the ethos, the neoliberal ethos that's just focusing on individualism. There's a lot of challenges for this group of former guerrilla members. That's one other subjectivity that I mentioned, and they might not be enough. They still have the challenge not to wake up in the morning and go to the work or feel they need an employment or the decision to go back to work, but to desire an alternative economy and keep on learning from the multiple experiences that existed nowadays, and they should be, probably if they're willing to new experiences, that will come to terms.